So welcome, we're making a rose. It's one of these small roses we're chasing in steel. You can see my chisels all laid out. I'm already done with all of them, but I've recorded one of the larger ones. Hopefully it'll be a little easier to see. So I have a long format, educational videos for Patreon. Thank you to my patrons. I hope you enjoy this. This is just going to be 2 episodes. I also have a time-lapse video that's going to be available for everyone so that you can kind of just see how that metal wants to kind of unfold and develop in a more plastic way. I find a time-lapse to be very valuable for that. Tell me what you think. Thank you so much for watching, and without further ado, let's jump in. This is approximately, 2.5, almost 3 inches of pitch. The room temperature in the room right now is 81 Fahrenheit. The insulation in this little one-car garage is pretty good. So it gets really hot during the day. Late day, it stays that warm pretty much all night. So when I come in, the pitch is just barely too cold to work on. So heating it up is actually really easy. So the first thing I did this morning was add a surface layer of heat just with a heat gun, because when I chased this rose before I left the studio last night, this edge just delaminated a little on me, as hammering down here forced that ripple to lift the edge. So by heating the whole thing, I got it nice and hot to where that was actually moving like putty. I stood on it in order to make sure I had good contact and no delamination. And now we're going to do the next rose. The reason I mention the heat at all is because that's something that I see people struggle with sometimes, is like, hey, I got my pitch and it's too brittle. It's not to worry, your pitch is probably okay. Not to say that you can't get really hard pitch, but that if you add some heat, it becomes very pliable. So when do you use high heat versus low heat? Low heat is going to make the pitch more resilient. It's not moving as much. Now we have 2 layers of resistance, the pitch itself and the material. The 3rd layer of resistance is going to be a variable. It's the focus of your tool and the weight of the hammer. Okay, so heavy weight, tiny tool, you have high penetration power, a high area of focus, and then you have these 2 variables. The material can change as it gets work hardened, and the pitch can change as you can warm it or cool it. Because the relief we're doing is pretty low relief, and I have everything, all my surface and volume prepared, we just have to lay out the petals, get them divided, and create the illusion of depth. Because I have it all prepared, I don't actually want this super gooey. I don't want it hot. That's pretty important on a step like this, because I want even support through the whole piece. I want the resistance to be consistent, through and through. We're only going to be working for about an hour, maybe an hour and a half, depending on how much cleanup I have to do, and how sometimes I'm not as clean as I'd like. But that's pretty close to the mark. But temperature management with your pitch is going to really grant access to what you're looking for. You can see all these hammer marks around the outside when I initially had the big gathering passes, and you can see this in any of my videos. Like I'm always adding more heat, okay? Because there's a lot of plasticity change. I need the pitch to have a higher temperature, so that is stickier, but so that it will also move and not just delaminate as the metal itself distorts. As the metal distorts, you sometimes have to stop, pull it off, and flatten out the entire background. For this project, I've done that twice already. So this one is a little further along, and I've gone back and held it over a shaping stake and planished the in-between fields you know, to a moderate degree. I'm not going in and cleaning up everything perfectly. I'm just making sure it's fairly consistent and that it's all a similar height. Because these will be forearm bracers. That's why the pattern has a bit of a taper. So it's smaller in the front, it's larger in the back, and these edges will get trimmed. I have a larger piece of metal to accommodate kind of the, I don't know, the area distortion I could predict. And you can also see I've stopped at a certain layer of detail, a certain level of detail. I felt okay going further with the roses because I think it's actually going to be easier to manage those from this point with it nice, open, and flat than when it's got the curve of the forearm, because those will, you know, wrap around the arm itself. And they're not for me, so my forearms are a little smaller, so they do look a little large, but the structure in the plate is also linear in a lot of ways. So the areas I have to really be careful of as it takes the curve are like these wings and losing some of the wolf. But because the curve isn't very great, and because the shapes were pretty linear, and because the steel is so strong, I can hammer on this pretty aggressively and get it to adopt a curve without losing, you know, the volume of what I've already created. We're going to be okay. It'll take it. You know, if you were to do this with a softer metal, you might have more to manage, and it might actually be much easier to do a little bit more of a curve sooner. But I've stopped at this level of detail because we'll put the curve in first and we'll finish up all the detail at the end. You don't have to worry about that. I'm just giving you some background information on this project because I thought it was important so you can see where I'm at and why. But today it's just a rose video, so why don't we get started? I've shaped this both ways, starting from the center, spiraling outward, and I've also started from the outside, spiraling inward. Why would you do either? I like the depth, I like the volume of and depth the spiral itself can get right there in the middle. When you start center outward, it's easy to pick out that center field first. But what happens as you continue to hammer one petal down at a time is you lose the line work from the petal underneath it. You have to retrace it in before you go forward. So it sort of adds a step. What I like about going outward in is you avoid that, but sometimes you don't get quite the the roll, like the curve into the center of the flower, as starting from the outside, working inward, can kind of flatten out the whole flower. So I'm going to go ahead and show you the outward in, because right now I think that is going to be just easier for everyone else to manage. And on a larger flower, again, these are only about 1 square inch. On a larger project, you could probably do either or and it wouldn't matter, but because it's so small, the management is going to be much simpler going outward in. So I'm going to single out the petals that kind of need to be laid down first, and we're just going to keep dancing back and forth, picking out one at a time, stacking it toward the middle. All right, let's reposition and get a good view of this. The first things first is getting in there with some planishers, and I'm going to start with a slightly heavier hammer, say it was like 8 to 10 ounces, I think. So it's a little bit more robust. I just like the kind of dead blow nature to it, favoring the corner. You're almost always going to find it easier to start from that outside edge and roll toward the center. If you start in the center and push outward, it displaces this corner and it becomes jagged and sharp, and it creates a burr edge that you'll have to mechanically remove later. Otherwise it just kind of gets in your way. You can probably tell that I've lost a little bit of the sharpness left over, or from my line work. Okay, so we kind of have a muddled line. The cleaner you are with your planishing, the easier it is to keep that. I'm just going to add it. I'm just going to put it right back. So it's not too big a deal. Once we move past some of these smaller outer petals that only kind of interact with themselves, like you've got to drop both sides on something like this, instead of a petal that comes up to, you know, multiple petals or comes across some different layers. While we're working in these, you know, this technique doesn't change. But once we get into some of these tighter curves, we're going to use a much smaller version of a chisel that has a really nice cut to it. So it's pretty assertive and pretty round. So it's got this one kind of favorable angle and then a radius of some kind. I have a few different smaller ones, some that are a little flatter. But essentially, this is the same tool, except it's got a much flatter bottom. Still has that angle. So those 3 petals were the only ones that are isolated. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. And now all of the other ones interact with one another in a weird way that isn't so cut and dry, so clean, and isolated. So we're just gonna start breaking it down into a few things. When you start to, we're gonna call this breaking the edge, when you come in from that outside soft, like change the angle of that corner and bring it inward. Breaking the edge on these next petals, that's a little bit more difficult because the back corner of your chisel can sometimes leave a mark. Because this is steel, it's not going to show up as much, and we're going to go back and make those inner bits deeper, so really don't worry about it. Just I'm curving this. You can see me going back and forth. When I come back on this line and make it deeper at an angle, pushing kind of against what would be the contour, I'm going to be able to stop short right there so that it has like a dip that also flows outward. So you get that really nice curve that a lot of petals will have. And this is one of those unique situations where chatter, the double stamping of the sharper edges of a planishing tool, normally is undesirable. In this pattern, it's going to look like the petal texture, so don't try and get rid of it. Just move quick, commit to a little chatter, as long as it's consistent. So move your chisel at an even rate as you add that texture. You'll see me do that a lot. You'll see me do that a lot later. I just want to make sure that you know why I'm leaving it so what would otherwise be kind of messy up front. So you can see how each petal we do builds the next one. We put the ones on the outside, then we gained access to this one, and then we gained access to this one, and now the corners that we need to break on this next petal are exposed, so we're going to start there. But before I do that, I'm just going to come in and support that petal. This is a curved liner. It's a little big. The bevel on it is cut in such a way that it will leave a really deep mark. And I'm going to come back and planish out some of what it leaves behind. Flipping it to fit the curve. By doing that, I'm really setting myself up for a nice, clean, division, you know, for this chisel to sit against. Gonna feel it with the corner. As I'm dragging it across this line, I'm rolling the chisel, so that way I can take a little bit more of a curve. And we come in, retrace just a little. Yeah, that's fine.